Okay, so the last bit that we're talking about is the internal and external validity of a study. So the quality or the rigor of your study is really embedded in these two terms. When you talk about the quality, the rigor of your study, what you're looking at is the internal validity of your study and the external validity of your study. The internal validity of your study refers to the confidence with which you can say that the changes in your dependent variable were in fact caused by your intervention or your treatment. So how confident do you feel that, for instance, in the example we were using before, how confident do you feel that the changes in smoking behaviors were in fact caused by your smoking cessation program? That's what you're looking at with internal validity. So again, how confident are you that the changes in your dependent variable were caused by your independent variable and aren't just because of some other outside factors that may be going on simultaneously? So that's internal validity. Again, one more time, internal validity is the confidence with which you can say that the changes in your dependent variable are in fact caused by your independent variable, that being by your intervention or your treatment. Then external validity is the second piece of this. External validity has to do with how confident you feel that your findings can be generalized to the rest of the population. So, for instance, if I surveyed 100 NKU students, depending on my research design and how rigorous it was, how confident do I feel that the findings that I found in my sample of 100 NKU students, that those findings can be generalized to all NKU students? Even though I didn't survey all of them, how confident do I feel that my findings among those 100 participants can be generalized to the rest of my population? So again, internal validity has to do with how confident are you that your changes in your dependent variable were caused by your intervention. External validity means how confident are you that your findings can be generalized beyond your sample to the entire population that you drew that sample from. So that internal and external validity of your study are determined entirely by your research design. So the more rigorous your research design is, the higher your internal and external validity will be. So if you use a pre-experimental research design, your internal and external validity are going to be lower. If you use an experimental research design, then your internal and external validity are going to be much higher. If you use, for instance, the Solomon 4 group design, that obviously will result in the highest internal and external validity. There are numerous threats to our internal validity and numerous threats to our external validity. And we're going to talk about both the threats to internal and the threats to external validity. These threats that are listed right here, those threats can be eliminated. We can control for those threats if we use more rigorous research designs. So the more rigorous our design is, the less of a threat each of these are, because we can statistically control for them when we have a more rigorous research design. So again, internal validity means that we feel confident that the changes in our dependent variable are caused by our independent variable, by our treatment. The factors that can lower our internal validity are, the first one is maturation. Maturation simply refers to the passage of time. So we know that with some variables especially, that the simple passage of time can lead to changes in those variables. The perfect example of that is grieving. We know that grieving is a process, and we know that people pass through different stages in the grieving process, and that occurs simply because of the passage of time. So whether or not somebody is participating in a grief group, they are going to pass through those stages of grief. So the simple passage of time can lead your dependent variable of grieving to change whether or not there is an intervention in place. So again, maturation is one of those things that you can control for if you have a control group in place. So if you have a treatment group and a control group, then you can statistically account for the threat of maturation. Another threat to internal validity is history. So with history, what we're referring to is if there is a specific event that occurs between your pretest and your post-test, that event can influence your results. So for instance, if you're doing a support group with veterans and you're looking at their depression rates, their depression scores from pre to post-test, well, if 9/11 happens between your pre and your post-test, that could very much have an impact on these veterans' depression rates, regardless of how your support group is going. So 9/11 may have very well had an impact on depression rates, and that then would have had an impact on that particular study. So it would really threaten your internal validity in your study. Again, as long as you have a control group in place, you can statistically account for those types of historical events. Another example there would be if I was measuring stress on a scale from 1 to 10 among all of my students, potentially, and let's say I'm doing a stress reduction group, it is very possible that another event would take place. Let's say you're enrolled in another class and there's an exam coming up in that class. Your anxiety rates may go up very much so despite my intervention because of that test that's coming up. Again, that's not something I have control over. It's an extraneous variable, but as long as I have a control group in place, I can account for that. Then there's the testing effect. We talked about the testing effect a little bit when we talked about the Solomon 4 group design. So the testing effect means that if you're asked to take a survey more than once, so if you do a pre-test and a post-test, participants may quote-unquote become better at taking that test. They may get an idea of what the researcher is looking for, and so they may answer their questions with that in mind. That's referred to as the practice effect. Pre-tests can also sensitize participants to a certain topic. So that's what I was talking about in the example before when we look at the relationship between pornography and violence against women. If people are already sensitized to the notion that you're looking at violence against women, then they are going to look for signs of violence against women when they're watching their pornographic clip. So again, by giving them that pretest, you may be sensitizing them to that topic, and that can then impact the results that you'll get on your post-test. The next thread here is instrumentation. So if you have changes in the way your instrument is being used or implemented, that can result in diminished internal validity as well. So for instance, if for the pretest you let them take the survey in a very comfortable setting and they have as much time as they like, but then at the post-test you make them take the post-test in a more institutionalized setting and you only give them 30 minutes to complete it, that can have a huge impact on your results, and therefore it can be a threat to your internal validity. The second to last threat listed here is selection of participants. If for some reason your control group and your experimental group differ from each other, so if there's no random assignment to the control group and the experimental group, then those two groups may be significantly different from each other, and that can impact your findings as well. So for instance, if I have two sections of a course and I just say, well, my one section is going to be my control group and my other section is going to be my treatment group because that's most convenient. While that may be the most convenient, that may also be a threat to my internal validity because let's say my control group, I have class with them in the evening, and my experimental group, I have them during the daytime. Well, those two classes may be very different. The people who sign up for a night class may have different responsibilities, different work lives, different family lives as compared to those that take the classes during the day. So again, that's why random assignment is so important. And then the last one on here is mortality or attrition. That simply means that you lose research subjects along the way from pre to post test. So let's say you start off with 40 participants that take your pre-test, but only 20 participants are left over at post-test. That type of mortality you have to wonder about. So how are the 20 people who dropped off, how are they different from the 20 people that stuck with it? There may be distinct differences between them that impact your findings. So those are the threats to the internal validity. Then when we go to the next slide, these are the threats to our external validity, and you'll see that some of them are the same. So again, just to repeat, external validity, that refers to how well our study findings can be generalized beyond our sample, so to your entire population from which your sample was drawn. The factors that can lower your study's external validity are, again, testing effect, so when there's sensitization or a practice effect, just like with internal validity. Selection bias can be a big deal for external validity, so the people who decided to participate in your study, whether they're in your control group or your treatment group, the people who decide to, for instance, take part in your 3-hour interview, they may be very different from the general population who said they don't want to participate. So, for instance, people who choose to participate in your study, maybe they're struggling with loneliness, and that's why they want to commit to 3 hours worth of interviews. The next one is reactive effects of the arrangements. So participants may act differently when they respond to your survey questions or your interview questions simply because of the research environment. They may be more nervous, they may be more productive, they may just act differently because they know somebody is watching them. And then the last one is multiple treatment interactions. So if your participants are exposed to more than one intervention at the same time, then it's very difficult to know whether the outcomes are based on your intervention or the other interventions that those participants might be involved in. So again, it's very difficult to tease out the impact of different interventions. Okay, so just to give a quick overview again of the importance of using rigorous research designs. So I'm going to use the example again of stress. So let's say I have two classes, and I'm going to measure you guys' stress, and I'm going to ask you to rate your stress on a scale from 0 to 10. If I used a pre-experimental research design, and I just did the pre-test, post-test design, so I give you a pre-test, then we have our stress reduction session, and then we have a post-test. Let's say, based on the pretest, at pretest, you guys' average stress score was a 4 out of 10. And at post-test, your average stress score went up to an 8. So your stress actually went up from 4 to 8. What would your conclusion be about my intervention at that point? If we just use this pre-experimental design, what would your conclusion be? The conclusion would have to be, your intervention sucks, right? It doesn't work because you went from stress level of 4 to 8. So the only conclusion you can draw at that point is the intervention doesn't work. But let's say instead of using the pre-experimental design, we actually use a quasi-experimental design. And we now have a control group that takes the pre-test and the post-test without the intervention. And what we see is that our treatment group, again, those of you who received the intervention, the stress reduction workshop, your stress level, again, it went up from 4 to 8. So there was a 4-point increase from 4 to 8. But what we see is that those of you who didn't get the intervention, the control group, their stress went from 4 to 10. So they actually had a 6-point increase in their stress level. So now what would your conclusion be? Seeing that with the intervention, stress went up with 4 points. Without the intervention, stress went up by 6 points. Now your conclusion would be, the intervention did work. The stress went, even though the stress went up, it did not go up by as much when people were exposed to the intervention. So by adding this control group, it's allowing us to rule out some of the threats like maturation, so the simple passage of time, and like history. If there were a specific event that occurred, like for instance, if all of a sudden you guys got a test back in another class and you know, a lot of you scored very poorly on that test, that may impact your overall stress level, and your stress level may go up significantly. But again, the treatment proved to still be effective in at least minimizing the extent to which stress went up. If then you went from quasi-experimental to experimental by adding random assignment, that would allow you to rule out even more extraneous factors. So it would allow you to rule out selection of participants, because now people would be randomly assigned to the treatment and the control group. And then if you went one step further still and you would use the Solomon 4 group design, again, still experimental, that would allow you to also rule out the testing effect. So again, by going from least to most rigorous research design, it allows you to rule out more and more of those threats to your internal and external validity.